Should we support Gavin Newsom's proposed 28th Amendment? Would America's air always look like New York's if we got rid of the EPA? And do we have two tiers of justice in this country? We'll discuss these issues and more on today's episode of Good Take, Bad Take. Hey friends, welcome to this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. This is the podcast where Donnie and I gather takes from all across the internet. We try to highlight the ones that are good, as well as shed some light on the ones that we think are bad. And I already mentioned him, but my co-host here is Donald Kimball. He's a great guy. And before we get started, make sure to like, share, subscribe. You can find us on Instagram at Good Take, Bad Take Pod, and on Twitter and YouTube at Good Bad Take Pod. And without further ado, let's get into some of these takes. So the first, we've got two takes, and we're critiquing one of them by Joe Walsh. But he's replying to a guy named Brian Krasenstein, who's kind of a left-wing provocateur. We can give that to his to Brian's Twitter feed. So he writes, breaking, Gavin Newsom has just proposed the 28th Amendment to the United States Constitution. The 28th Amendment will take 4 gun safety measures and enshrine them in our Constitution. They are as follows. 1, it will raise the minimum age to purchase any gun to 21 years of age. 2, it will require that there is a reasonable waiting period for gun purchases. 3, it will require universal background checks. And 4, it will ban the civilian purchase of assault weapons. Here are my thoughts. I personally would change number 4 to not ban all purchases, but make it much more difficult for the average American to purchase such a weapon. Make them jump through hoops. I would also add a stipulation that all guns should be insured. Would you not support this amendment? Why or why not? And then Joe Walsh, commenting on the same deal, replied, respectfully, Governor, no, and the facts should matter. California has had each of these laws in place for years, some for decades. California still has too many mass shootings. Their gun homicide rate equals Florida's and is higher than many permit-less concealed carry states. This is a political move. I guess you want us to critique both of these, right?
Yeah, I thought we'd look at both because they're both replying to the video that Gavin Newsom put out outlining this. One, in case anyone was wondering, yes, Gavin Newsom is so ready to run for president whenever Biden bows out. If Biden bows out, that is what he is doing here, and it's absolutely cringe. But I wanted to look at both of these because I thought that Joe Walsh, for as much as we do criticize him, I think that he here is showing that he does have principles. Now, I don't think they're necessarily the right principles, but I do think he actually has a principle to something here, because I would argue that amongst his base and amongst his core audience, this is not necessarily a very popular thing to say and a very popular message. Preaching to the oh, Donald Trump is evil and corrupt and has done everything wrong and has never done anything right in his life. That's easy. That's so easy to say. You're not going to you might get rejected from your former base, but you're going to be open, welcome with open arms to so many kinds of moderates or left-wing people, just the mainstream conglomerates and stuff. But saying, pointing out the facts of California's lack of, gun safety, even with these in there, that's not necessarily very politically easy for him. So I did want to give him kudos and say that what he's saying is absolutely right. Yeah. If you look at so many of the stipulations that are in this, without even going into Brian's actual substance of his post, which I want to get to as well, but raising the minimum age to 21, in the video, which we're not including here, but you can look it up if you want to add views to Gavin Newsom's videos, I suppose. He says, the first one, we raise the minimum age of any gun purchase to 21 years old. Because if you're not old enough to buy a drink, you shouldn't be old enough to buy a gun. And I thought that was such a stupid point, because on so many levels. But the one that immediately jumps out to me is that setting the arbitrary law age limit of 21 and saying, if you're not old enough to do this because of some arbitrary law we've set, well, then this other arbitrary law we've set should match it or something. You're not actually giving a reason. It'd be like, for the same purpose, I could say, well, if you're not old enough to receive Social Security, you're not old enough to drink. It makes it just as much sense. You're taking one arbitrary measure of a law qualification and measuring it to another one. If anything, when you say that, you think, yeah, maybe we should bring the drinking age down, because it is ridiculous that governments prevent people from doing that. Because just as people are irresponsible with alcohol and buy it underage all the time and are going to be irresponsible if they don't have proper discipline and training, which is something the family needs to provide, they are similarly going to have that lack of restraint and safety in other areas. regardless. So people act as though the law is going to magically stop 18-year-olds from getting the guns if this were to happen. That won't be the case. And the people who you are barring are the 18-year-olds who particularly want to look out for themselves.
Yeah, I agree with you on Joe Walsh's take. I mean, it's kind of an ironclad defense,
Yeah.
just laying out the facts. It's really good. Like that's the way you should reply to someone saying this stuff. I saw, and not to say that this is a good way to argue, but it is a illuminating stat, which is if you took the five cities in the United States out of like the out of the calculus about gun violence in the United States, which are all Democrat-run cities and Democrat-run states. If you took them out of the calculus, the United States goes from like number 9 in terms of gun violence to like 193rd, right? So it's like basically goes from the upper echelon of where high levels of gun violence to like nothing. And so Joel Walsh points out a really good point of fact that it's like, oh yeah, it's not the amount of gun laws. It's actually like an issue with our souls, and people will commit violence one way or the other with whatever tools they have available to them. And we've talked about like Scotland before, because people bring up Scotland. It's like, yeah, you eliminated all of the gun violence, but now like knife violence and acid attacks and other types of violence are actually on the rise. And people that have to jump through all the hoops that Brian Krasenstein is talking about now have to wait longer to be able to get something to defend themselves in any of those instances. The other thing that jumped out right away to me with the raise the minimum age to purchase any gun to 21 years of age is that like, oh, but Governor Newsom is perfectly fine, potentially shipping 18-year-olds over to Ukraine and
Yeah.
handing them, an assault rifle, to go fight over there. So I always thought it was really funny how, you're 18 is old enough to go be sent over to a foreign country to kill people. And to also watch your friends get blown up, but it's not old enough to, have the right amount of wisdom to determine whether or not you should drink or not. They're developed enough to make that life changing decision, but they're not developed enough to decide whether they're going to drink alcohol. And obviously, I mean, it's even more of a parallel with like the gun, right? It's like, so oh, you're not wise enough to like be able to purchase a gun, but if you're going to go kill the people we want you to kill, then you're allowed to have it. So
Yeah,
yeah,
you're also apparently able to fathom what taking out, a college loan from the government is and the amount of money that you're putting yourself in. You're totally fine there to do that as well when
yes,
you're 18, I guess.
yes,
Yeah, the last little amendment Brian Krasenstein makes that you mentioned is so incredibly stupid because it's like he's taking the very term and phrase and issue that people who don't support gun control laws bring up, and he's saying it's a feature, not a bug, which is I would make for to not ban them all, but make it more difficult to make them jump through hoops. So it's the stupidest policy on both sides, really, because on the one hand, you're not outright banning. So any hope that anyone would have if this law is effective, you're not totally eliminating the assault rifles from being in circulation. And of course, you and I wouldn't say that that would happen, but if you did believe that the government had some level of effectiveness in this, you would want them completely banned. But you're not going there, so they still exist in some form. But then also he's saying that then the average American has to jump through hoops to get them, which is the exact thing that we claim is you're making it difficult for people who would otherwise not, like it's not like someone who is going to use it for violence, use it for ill, is dead set on getting one, is like, well, there's too many hoops to jump through. I'm not going to do that. You know who are the people who are going to do that? The everyday people who are like, I want something for self defense, but man, this is a lot of paperwork. I've got a lot going on. This just isn't worth it. The reasonable, normal people who want it for self defense are the ones who you are making through jump through hoops. It's absurd to think that the kinds of people who are going to commit violence aren't the most obsessive, dead set on doing this kind of action and you think about like gangs and gang violence, and that is the majority of shootings, right? It's not these lone mass shooting individuals who are crazy. That's another matter. But in the gang world, one, they're going to have their own suppliers, but two, the amount of pressure not only to have something that you can use effectively because you're in a life or death territory war when you're part of the gang. Not only that, there's also the pressure to have the best thing for your own individual status. So the very people who are going to be incentivized to jump through all the hoops are the very people you shouldn't be having get access to them in the first place if you're trying to prevent access through the law. So the law doesn't cover the people who it needs to the most, and it only covers the people who need it the most. And
Yeah.
regardless, even if it did ban it all, this wouldn't work. Like I said, the gangs will have their supply lines. People will get a hold of them regardless. But I just thought that this sort of like middle ground he tries to take to be, I would be more reasonable here. It's like,
Yeah.
no, I honestly respect the position of banning them all more than this weird wishy-washy middle ground that doesn't work on either theory.
Yeah, yeah, it's just an effort to appear reasonable without actually solving the issue. It's like, well, at
Yeah.
least take the actual strongest line of argument, if you're gonna
Yes.
if you're gonna make the case for this. So yeah, good take on Joe Walsh's part, bad take on Brian Krasenstein's.
Yes.
All right, let's move on to the next one. We've got two takes here. One is from Twitter, and they have a picture of New York, which right now is engulfed in smoke from Canada, from wildfires in Canada. And this person writes, "This is what America's air would look like every day if it wasn't for the EPA regulations that Republicans want to strip away." And then we've got Film Lad quote retweeting climate defense and
Defiance.
climate defiance. Sorry, it's a little
Yeah.
small on my screen.
Even more cringy. Even more
Yeah,
cringy.
climate defiance. And I mean, the post itself is pretty cringy.
Yeah.
But climate defiance writes, "We choked on our own air today. We wiped soot off of our countertops. We rushed our children to ERs and canceled picnics and called up morgues to cart off our dead. Welcome to the future," with a picture of an orange New York. And then Film Lad replies, quote retweets, "Look at all that carbon environmentalists threw into the atmosphere by refusing to allow proper forest management." Which of these is good? Which of these is bad?
Okay, well, I think we already gave a little bit away about climate
Yes.
defiance. That one is ridiculous. It's so melodramatic. And obviously,
Carted
the
off our
first,
dead. Like,
yeah, I contacted all of my friends in New York today, incidentally, and they're all fine, even the ones that are kind of in the thick of it. So they're like, it's really bad. Like my sister found out that her windows were not airtight, but had to get some insulation there. But we're not carting off any dead. It's not,
yeah.
we're not Monty Python over here yet. But the man, there's a lot of good all around. But the thing that I really like about Film Lad's response to the climate defiance one, because I want to start there on the good take and then maybe move into some of the bad. He says, "Look at all the carbon environmentalists threw into the atmosphere by refusing to allow proper forest management." That is so unbelievably true and accurate, because why is the carbon in the air? Why is all this massive gross? It's from forest fires. How do forest fires spread and grow out of control? It's from mismanaged forests. What causes mismanaged forests? A lot of dead trees and overgrowth. So, one of the things that environmentalists love to do is say, save the trees, never cut them down. We have to stop deforestation, without recognizing that the incentives for the property owners who own tree farms is that there continues to be trees there, right? If they chop down all of the trees and they remove any form of regrowth, they don't have any promise of future growth and future profit and investment in when they want to sell the farm or when they want to let their children inherit it or however they plan on getting rid of it. The thing that people think is, oh, they're obviously just going to burn the turf, like chop them all down, get the money, and then get out of there. But part of the incentive structure, when you own a business of any kind or an asset of any kind, is when you sell that asset, you want it to be in better shape than you found it, so that that is part of the sale. Because people don't think about the fact that when you get a tree farm, most of the time you have to make some sort of purchase, at the very least investing in its maintenance and you taking care of it, and resource and tools, things like that, let alone if you had to buy the land and the property. So it's not a matter of having this tree farm, cutting down all the trees, leaving no forests ever, and then then getting rid of it because you want to be able to sell it, and you're not going to be able to sell a totally devastated tree forest to anyone. No one would want to buy that. Why am I going into all this? Well, the reason is because the environmentalists want to stop this kind of deforestation. They want to put in their government set limits rather than allow the people who own these plots to manage them. And when you don't allow them to manage it, the problem is you get improper calculations on how much thinning needs to happen. Because when you don't thin out enough trees, they grow old, they grow clustered, they die. And when natural fires do occur, which is a common occurrence, the problem is they're all too clustered. They're very dry because of all the dead trees in there and all the branches that have fallen and haven't been able to be forested or cleaned up. And then it spreads out of control. Whereas if you have a properly managed forest that has regular deforestation in healthy amounts, then the fires can be very easily contained because they're more spread out. There's not as many dead and decayed trees. And when you look at the fires, but the Pacific Northwest up here, we're no strangers to bad air quality because of this. We get it from California, we get it from Canada to the north as well. And and I can't remember what the stat was, but a couple of years ago when we were having some, I read a stat and I want to say it was something like 75 to 80% of all of the forest fires that are happening on government owned or regulated lands as far as deforestation. They're the ones unable to take care of it, unable to manage it, and they're the environmentalist quote unquote community is the ones that are causing these forest fires that are causing this mass amount of air quality um, decrease.
Yeah, and what people don't realize is that forests and trees, at least up here in the Northwest, like my great grandfather was a forester, and he was like, "Oh, fire is actually essential to having healthy forests because, like, not only to your point of like it clears out the dead and rot, the heat also is what helps pine cones and various different types of seed delivery mechanisms to actually release their seeds to plant new trees, right? So even after a forest fire occurs, and dead and even healthy trees are removed in the process, like it seeds the ground for new trees to come about, right? Like it's the actual proper cycle, and it's been built into how these trees kind of develop and their whole life cycle. So it's like really important. And to your point again, like it's just funny how environmentalists who know nothing other than they see fire and they see on news that the climate is bad and climate defiance is telling us that we're carting off our dead and this is the future. It's like no, this is actually the present, right now. But they only see that, but it's like, oh well, the foresters and the people who actually know stuff about this and are saying like, hey, we actually need to do a controlled burn or things like this are being denied. Like I think about the issues in like Northern California with the forest fires. It's like, yeah, it's because of mismanagement that these things are not that these things are getting out of control. And this was all the way obviously up in Canada, which is kind of funny as well. But I want to go to the first tweet, which is this is what America's air would look like every day if it wasn't for the EPA regulations that Republicans want to strip away. Not a big fan of Republicans, but I do want to address the EPA. And I thought about our one of our past guests, Larry Sharp, when we talked about the like, well, we need to strip away with like building codes and regulations. And then, well, what about the argument that like, hey, in Florida, you had a condo fall over because a condo complex fall over because they weren't built to standard. It's like, well, did the building code and regulations not exist, down
Yeah.
there? That's like, no, they do. Like in his words, the apocalypse is now, right? Like it's already here. All these things are already happening. The EPA exists and the fires happen, right? And obviously this happened up in Canada, but this happens all the time over here in the Northwest. Like around July, August timeframe, you just can't even go outside. And it made me think about, like people talk about like Flint, Michigan, or the lesser known examples of Sebring in Ohio, the various water issues all being had oversight by the EPA. EPA officials were involved in it. The government officials were the ones managing it. And because they weren't properly managed, they were mismanaged, they caused all these issues. So yeah, these things happen when kind of exclude the people who care the most about these things and have the most knowledge about them and have the most incentive to care about them. And then you kind of outsource it to some bureaucrat who doesn't actually care, has some sort of incentive involved, and is not going to do a good job. And I think in the case of Ohio with Sebring, like, it was directly the fault of three EPA employees. But they were fired, but their names were never given out. No one ever knows who they were. They've been free to go on their way. So much for the transparency of the government being held accountable. In fact, I think a lot of these things would probably be better off if there was. I mean, you and I both agree they'd be a lot better off if there was no EPA involved, because then people who actually care about it would care about it and and would have the power to do things without having to check in with their big brother.
Yeah, I it's also just I mean the last thing I'll say is I love that this is what America's air would look like every day. But as you kind of alluded to earlier, this is Canada's fault, right? And aren't they supposed to be way more environmentally conscious and way
Yeah.
more to the left of us anyway? So it's really funny that this sort of false this is what it would be every day if the Republicans didn't exist. Like even the people who are supposed to be better on this than you are causing it to happen. So it seems like it's similar to me. It reminds me of the COVID thing where it's like wear the mask and you won't get sick. Well, get the vaccine and you won't get sick. Well, you got sick, but it would have been so much worse
Yeah.
if you hadn't had the vaccine. It's this constantly moving goalpost of well, the air got bad because the left's in there, but it'd be so much worse if the Republicans were in control. And it's like you can only gaslight people so much. It's just kind of a silly thing to say. It would have been worse otherwise. Which again, it's I'm not saying that's impossible. In some cases, those kinds of things can be true, but it's just really funny when that's your only line of argument and core line of argument. You have nothing to back that up except vague things like it's the Republicans. They just want to cut all the regulations, and you're not actually demonstrating how the regulations they want to cut would have added to this. When I think quite clearly, better forestry would have, which is a more conservative principle anyway.
Yes. Yep. All right. Moving on to our next one. We've got a quote retweet of MMA fighter Jake Shields, and Jake Shields writes, "I see many men on Twitter wanting to marry virgins. Where do you hope to find these virgins? Who will you have sex with while you're waiting to get married? What if you have no sexual chemistry after you get married?" And Jared Monroe quote retweets this saying, "Predicting marriage on quote sexual chemistry unquote is one of the main reasons we have a 41% divorce rate in this country, and that's just for first time marriages." What are your thoughts as a married man, Donnie?
Uh, I think Jared's take is excellent and correct, and Jake Shields is not so excellent or correct. The thing that I want to point out here is I see many men in Twitter wanting to marry virgins. Where do you hope to find them? Okay, first of all, the the premise that you should hope for someone who has been sexually pure, you should hope for that, but it's hard to come by. Why does that at all defeat I don't see, like, why are you pointing out gotcha, that's hard to find. Gotcha. It's like, yeah, that
The
is
ideal
very
can be hard to
increasingly
find.
difficult. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. I mean, as someone who works towards being an MMA fighter, I'm sure you would admit that the easy path isn't always the right path, right? Like, okay, and then who will you have sex with while you wait to get married? Okay, you're making a predication and assumption that I think Jared points out here. What about sexual chemistry? I want to go over the other points that Jared doesn't point out, but before I get into that, but who you have sex? No, that's the point. Is you shouldn't, right? Like that is part of the cultural change that should happen. You should be celebrating that and say, I see many men who in Twitter wanting to marry virgins. Where do you hope to find them? Our culture has derided this. Hopefully, we need to change the culture, and that's part of it. Men wanting to marry virgins should be a cultural norm just as much as women wanting to marry virgin men should be, right?
Yes.
And you need to live up to that exact same standard. You shouldn't have that double standard. And the fact that like completely goes over his head is really funny to me. But for the main point here on the sexual chemistry thing, I think Jared is absolutely on the money here, because when people, one, think of sexual chemistry as the most important part of a marriage, it does a few things completely wrong. One, it puts that at the center and the focus of a marriage, when that is absolutely not what should be at the center and the focus of your marriage. Your marriage needs to be about your ability to love the other person, and it's not a feeling, right? It is an action. It's a choice. It's about your ability to put aside your own wants, put aside your own needs, and put the other before your own in a mutual way that your relationship is built on, right? Obviously, theologically, I think it also needs to be built on your foundation of God. But if we're talking in a more broad sense here, if you're not theistic, at the very least, you need your marriage to be built on a shared worldview too. Because
Yeah.
if you have totally different thoughts about how the world is going to work, what values are important, then you're going to it doesn't matter what your sexual chemistry is. It's going to completely blow up in your face. And that's the problem. One of the problems with putting sexual chemistry as the first and foremost value in your marriage is you're elevating sex to this unrealistic level that even if you had the most perfect sexual partner in the world, the problem is that nothing stays the same forever, and there are going to be days in which it doesn't work for you, or you're gonna want to go wild and crazy, because as humans we are never content with what we have. That is just part of our fallen nature. When you think about the richest people in the world, they often keep striving to build more wealth, and they never feel like they have enough. They always have to move up. They always got to keep climbing that corporate ladder. Contentedness is not natural to humans. It's part of the learning experience of discipline, is learning to be content. And so when you pin everything on sexual chemistry, part of the problem is uh, eventually you feel that sexual chemistry isn't what it could be. Even if you're perfectly content and happy, if that is the focal point, you're gonna start searching elsewhere for it, and that's gonna wreck a marriage as well. Um, and that only gets exacerbated when the other parts of your marriage are not in alignment, such as worldview, personality, care, discipline, love, respect, etc.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on that. And Jared Monroe's point is great. And I'm actually a pretty big fan of Jake Shields. From an MMA standpoint, and then as well as I think he gets a lot of things right in general. But this is a big issue. This is not correct at all. And I checked it. Jake Shields is not married, so I would on that standpoint alone don't take his advice, right? And there could be a lot of reasons why that happened and stuff. But in general, you want to be receiving advice from people that have successful marriages, right? Like I value the advice I've received from people who've been married 30, 40, 50 plus years and have had issues, obviously, but worked through them and remain together and are still happily married at that age. And I think, a big sign of that, for me and my wife, like we waited to have sex until we were married. That I waited, I didn't have any sex at all until I was married. And, I'm thankful for that. And people, in our culture now, which has made that so rare. Like people kind of look at me with strange and think, why? That's so weird and all this stuff. But I think for me, what it was is that like marriage, making the decision to be married, and we didn't live together or anything like that either before we got married. Obviously, that kind of goes hand in hand with sex, I guess these days. But I think that marriage was a conscious decision, and it's like there are things that are reserved to be part of that, right? It's like there's before you're married and then there's after you're married. And like it's helpful and good and very important, I think, to have a distinction of like these are things you can do when you're married and these are things you can't. And by saving those things, they become more special, right? Because it's like now that I am married and we can have sex and we can, be intimate together and all these different things, like now it is a special thing. Now it is reserved within marriage. And that just reinforces the bond that you have and reinforces the boundaries that occur. Right. So it's like, yeah, of course not. Like I've never had sex outside of marriage. So I'm not going to start having sex outside of marriage. Like that's the only way that I've ever experienced it. That's the only way my wife and I have ever experienced it together. And so that's a really good thing. It really reinforces that stuff. And then on top of that, like it's just an appropriate boundary, right? Like I think most people would, if you said, hey, do you think it's a good idea before you get married, before you're even engaged, for you to combine your bank accounts? And most people are like, no, that's so stupid. It's like,
Yeah.
well, how much more important, right? How much more important is this aspect of I mean, finances are a really important part, but like we kind of have a natural recoil because it's like, well, there's no commitment there, so therefore we shouldn't have finances. We shouldn't entangle things that shouldn't be entangled yet until there's been a commitment. And that's the beauty of being intimate after you've been married, is that like, oh, not this reinforces the commitment I've made to you, that it is only to you. And yeah, so there's a lot of issues with Jake Shields stuff. That's where I take principally. And then two, it's like, men, you just shouldn't be having sex before you're married. Like
Yeah.
you just shouldn't do that. Like it's just not a good thing. It's not good and respectful to other men. It's not good and respectful to the woman or not married to that you're having sex with. And it's most of all, it's not good for your own soul to be doing that, to be having multiple partners. Marriage is and sex is meant for marriage. It's meant to procreate. It's meant to reinforce that bond between you and your wife, and you're only doing yourself and your future wife a disservice when you do that sort of stuff.
the our culture is so bent on the destroying anything of the spiritual realities of this life, that they will insist that it's purely a physical thing, a physical pleasure. Why not? Like, oh, so what? There's nothing. But there is undeniably an absolute spiritual connection that you have in that. The intimacy, the reason why it's sort of referred to as being intimate and intimacy, is because there is a shared emotional spiritual connection that goes far beyond just a physical pleasure. It's not like you have sex with your wife and you're like, wow, that was just as pleasurable as like eating a delicious chocolate cake, right? Like they're entirely different things. They're both enjoyable, but one is meaningful and intimate, right? And there's a reason for that on a spiritual dimension. And so when you try to divorce marriage from that spiritual aspect, when you try to divorce sex from that spiritual aspect, you're just going to find yourself dissatisfied and constantly yearning for something more, rather than treating it as the sacred thing that it is, as sort of degrading it to this animalistic pleasure. You're going to find yourself discontent, and that's going to drive up things that will cause friction in a marriage, and the divorce rates to spiral higher. So
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And I think that like there's a reason why I can't remember. I think it's like 60% of folks who live together before they get married will get divorced. And it's because you've normalized the ability to just kind of get out
Yeah,
of whatever it is. It's like,
exactly.
well, we're gonna try it out and all this stuff. And that also speaks to, it's like, so Jake, like, if there is no sexual chemistry, but this person is loving, self-sacrificing, is going to be a fantastic mother to your kids, is going to be someone that can take care of you when you're older, and someone that you want to take care of when you're older, basically checks every single box of being a fantastic life partner, is aligned in all ways, and where you're going and what you will eventually be, and cares about who you're becoming, but you don't have like the best sexual chemistry. Is that like, oh well, we're not going to get married? Is like where in the hierarchy should that be? It's like, well, it's important. I'm not saying it's not important, but is it a reason to like get rid of all those other things? It's like, it's not the only dimension to evaluate whether a marriage is going to be good on. If it's not the only dimension, and I don't think it's even an important one to evaluate like before you're married, as you and I have both lived out. Um, so yeah, it's just like that. Like, think about everything about a successful marriage, and think about when you're 80 years old, because that's the ideal thing, right? Is that you're married for 50, 60 years, you reach 80, 85, 90, and maybe things don't work the same way that they do at that age as they do when you're 30. It's like, okay, well, things that are true from age 30 to 80 years old should be the things that you evaluate the parameters of whether they're successful and whether this is a good marriage or not things that can fade and not continue to work for lack of a better term as you get older. So my I had a mentor when I was getting married. He'd been married, I think he's been married almost 45 years. And I asked him, I said, well, give me some advice. He said, look, you're going to wake up to a different person every 10 years. Like, they're going to be different. Like, they're going to be different because you had kids. They're going to be different because of different types of grief you go through, different types of loss, different types of seasons. And you just have to realize that, like, who you're committing to right now is going to be different in 10 years and the 20 years and 30 years after that. And you have to be married to who they're becoming. And so that's what a successful marriage is built on, not, the sexual chemistry that you have today. That's a really nearsighted, short-sighted way to think about whether a partner would be good for you or not.
Absolutely right.
All right, moving on to our last one. We've got Vivek Ramaswamy, Republican presidential candidate. And I'm assuming this is on the heels of Trump getting indicted today.
Yes, that's
Okay.
correct.
So he writes, we can't have two tiers of justice, one for Trump, another for Biden, one for Assange, another for Manning, one for BLM and Antifa, and another for peaceful protesters at January 6th. I never thought we'd see the day when the US president deputizes the DOJ to arrest his lead rival in the middle of an election. Obama shamefully tried to deputize the FBI to infiltrate Trump's 2016 campaign, but they're leaving nothing to chance this time around. The federal police state is outright arresting Trump. This is an affront to every citizen. We cannot devolve into a banana republic where the party in power uses police force to arrest its political opponents. It's hit DOJ to selectively prosecute Trump, but not Biden. There are also serious legal questions about the president's power to declassify documents and the potential illegality of the overclassification of federal documents in the first place. That's for the courts to decide. But, quote, we the people, unquote, decide who governs this nation. It would be much easier for me to win this election if Trump weren't in the race, but I stand for principles over politics. I commit to pardon Trump promptly on January 20th, 2025, and to restore the rule of law in our country. What do you think?
This is a mostly pretty good take, I think. Um, you know, you think about what I mean, what the average governor did during COVID, right? You think about our Washington state governor issuing these kinds of draconian lockdowns in spite of knowing and requiring vaccines for state employees, in spite of knowing these things do not work, and yet there's no repercussions. And what has Trump done in this case? He's taken some classified documents and like held on to them. Has he distributed them? No. Has he shared them with foreign intelligence? No. This is the lowest bar for any president. The presidents commit crimes all the time.
Yeah.
They should all be thrown in prison but this is the absolute least affronting thing that he could possibly do, and they are looking for any excuse. I think the highlighting of the tier of justice for Assange and Manning, BLM, Antifa, and peaceful protesters is a perfect analogy to this, where you have people who are just egregiously breaking laws, breaking rules, breaking norms, and it's completely overlooked. And then you have some people doing some things that are technically illegal and probably shouldn't be, and they're getting the full force of the law. And it's wild. Um, I think the other thing he kind of hints at, which I wish he would have gone a little bit more in on, and I think would have made it an even better take, was, when he hints at there are also serious legal questions about the president's power to declassify and illegality of overclassification, because that is a huge deal. The amount of documents the government classifies is absurd, both on the federal level and on the state level. Again, I have more experience personally with stuff on the state level, but they will try to classify things to save themselves embarrassment, let alone
Yeah.
things that are, indicting of them. They are very, very quick to overclassify things. They're very, very quick to withhold evidence if they can. And all of that being said, when that's the premise on which Trump is being indicted, it probably behooves us all to think and look, are these things that are being classified really worth it? Because you're about to sentence the former president of the United States and front runner for the GOP nominee as of now to prison because of overclassification potentially, because he's holding on to documents that potentially shouldn't even be classified.
Yeah, and I mean, there's arguments to be made about whether or not like he can declassify them himself, right? Simply by
Yeah.
taking them and things like that. Yeah, it's always so funny to think about that. Like, of all the things to try and get Trump over, like this is what they're going to try and get. And it makes you realize that he probably is pretty squeaky clean, at least on the like, the stuff that is really salacious side of
Yeah.
things.
Yeah.
Because if
You
they
think
had
it'd be
some
easier to get a big tyrant, the big neo-Nazi authoritarian dictator they called him. You think it'd be easier to get him on something, right?
Yeah, exactly. So there ought to be something more salacious. And when you realize that, like, oh yeah, the Russian collusion thing was just total bunk, and then you see this, it's like, oh yeah, he had a couple boxes or whatever at Mar-a-Lago, and he didn't even distribute them or anything like that. We don't even really know exactly what was in them in the first place. It could have just been stamped classified, as you were talking about earlier. It just makes you realize that, like, oh yeah, they're out to get him on whatever technicality they can. And I agree with you. It's like I would love for every single president, basically of my lifetime and prior to my lifetime, to be arrested. And I think obvious things to do that on, namely just basically all of the war crimes and unconstitutional things that they've done. Um, but and that doesn't exclude Trump, right? Like I would love to see Trump be indicted for a lot, the war in Yemen and various and the strike on the Iranian general and different things like that. I think were awful and bad and illegal and an abuse of power. What's hilarious is those are the things that he's kind of praised for, right, by his peers, and they're never going to get him on those things, because if they got him on those things, they would have to get themselves, right, and it opens them up to stuff. So they're forced to resort to things that are somewhat salacious and that can appeal to people's short-term memory and 10-second news briefing on what's going on, and so this is what they've had to resort to. um, so yeah, if this is all that they've got, he seems pretty squeaky clean, which is somewhat surprising. I do think it's really scary to see that we've got these two levels of justice. It's not like we've always had this in some form or fashion. Basically ever since we just always have had this ever since Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. We've had different levels of, oh well, these journalists are okay, and we're going to throw these journalists in jail and stuff like that. But this is just so blatant and in your face. And what's kind of scary about it, at least, is that we've got the internet now, and so half the country, or 70 million people who voted for Trump in 2020, see this stuff and they're like, oh yeah, this doesn't seem right, this seems wrong, and I've got no faith in this whole deal. And like, what happens if they do arrest him? What if they say that, oh yeah, you can't vote for the guy that you want to vote for? uh, it kind of leads us to a really scary place. And I'm curious to see. I mean, we'll see what happens. I can't believe that they would actually go for it, but it appears that they are.
Yeah. Well, I mean, people have been pointing out that this kind of insane division and this arbitrary two-tiered justice, prior to this, is going to lead into the hands of an actual authoritarian. And that's 100% what's going to happen here, where, we're going to have someone rise up. Let's say they manage to arrest Trump and somehow they don't have riots of people, trying to storm and actual, violence. You're going to have someone rise up and say, look, we're we're gonna pardon Trump. We're gonna go as far as we need to. We're going to get rid of all these bureaucrats. I mean, some of it was going to sound appealing and good to people. And they're going to elect someone who's going to basically oust everyone, get his own people in, and sort of cement his own power. And the pendulum is just going to keep swinging back and forth. And that's maybe one of the better scenarios, right?
Yeah.
Like getting someone going to be an authoritarian might be the better outcome than from like mass like civil war division. So, um, yeah, I think that there's the level of impartiality being so blatant is it is shocking, uh, and it wouldn't be shocking if the ability for everyone to also see so clearly the other corruption, if that didn't exist, then maybe, everyone's sort of thinking like, oh, this is so two-tiered, this is such a small thing they're getting Trump on, they just don't like him, it's a technicality, it'd be whatever. But the fact is, you have things like, the very serious allegations on Biden, you have the very real, things like James Clapper lying before Congress, you have the very, very visible and destructive examples of BLM protesters to directly contrast with what people perceive as an unfair treatment. So it's not just you wouldn't do this if you were in our shoes situation. It's you didn't do this when
Yeah.
they were in your situation. And that is much more dangerous, I think.
Yeah. Absolutely. I don't have any more on this one unless you do.
All right. Nope. I think we're good.
Cool. Awesome. Well, friends, thanks for hanging out with us for this show. If you have any takes that you want us to evaluate, please feel free to send them to us and we'll catch you on the next one.